Thank you. All right, welcome everyone to a special meeting of the MCS Board of Directors. This is an OSBA board training night. It is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. We have no public pre-submitted comments. Are there any changes to the agenda? And Kristen, did you see the agenda?
No.
Let me share it on my screen real quick. And if you have anything you want to adjust, let me know, since you are running the training. Is that visible?
There we go. Most responsibilities. Yep, that's what I've got.
Excellent. I'll make a motion then that we approve the agenda as written. Can I get a second? I can't see everyone, so just let me know.
I'll second you, Dan.
Thank you, Emily. All those in favor? Any opposed, voice or opposition? All right, we've approved the agenda. Thank you. That brings us to number 4, the training topics. And with that, Kristen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Okay, I will go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, should be able to see the right thing. Thank you for having me. Always pleased to be with you. Tonight we're going to do exactly what's on your agenda. Brought some material with me. As always, I've probably said this to you before. This is your time, not mine. And so as I bring material with me, but as there are things that you want to stop and talk about or have questions about, please do that. Please stop and ask questions. Please bring up your own scenarios that you want to talk through. We will absolutely do that and get covered what you want to have covered. So I would love to go through and just do quick introductions. You'll see me looking over here. This is where my screen is over here, where my PowerPoint is. Your time on the board, where'd you go to high school, and why are you on the board? So I'm going to start with somebody, and then you get to choose the next person. So we'll do the classroom thing where we popcorn around the room in that way. So I'm going to start with Emily.
I was just going to look to see how long I've been on the board. I think it is a year or just over a year, possibly. My name is Emily Strands, and I went to high school in Westland High School, which is a suburb of Portland, Oregon. Born and raised here in Oregon. And the reason that I am on the board is, one, I like to be involved in my community in general. And the Mosier Community School is such a wonderful community to be involved in. So I'm here to lend support and to help and just to be an active member in that community. And I will pass it to Marie.
Hi, I'm Marie, and I joined June of 2023. I went to high school in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at a school of 2,500 students. And I am on the board because I have a daughter who's attending school, and now that I'm a parent, I recognize even more all the opportunities I received as a youth and benefited from. I had no idea at the time that there were school boards involved in my music program that I love, art programs, that all the things that have took away so many good memories of my schooling. So anyhow, it's nice to just be able to appreciate all the work that goes into schools and see kids thriving and hopefully doing well. So that's why I'm here.
And who will you pass it to?
Oh, I'm looking right at Dan because he's so Dan, I'll pass it on to you.
All right, my name is Dan Watson, and I went to high school in Churchill High School, which is in Eugene, Oregon. Mm-hmm. And I've been on the board for 4 years, I believe. I reached out to Thad when we were becoming a part of this community, and the school really drew me to the community, and so I wanted to be able to give back in a way that was meaningful. And so I was a past board member and was the chair at the time, and so I reached out to him to get involved.
And who will you pick?
I'll go to Tiffany.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Strands, and I just got on the board in like end of June this year. So I'm a newbie, and I went to school in Elko, Nevada. Not many people know, but it's in Northeast Nevada, a small town. And I'm on the board because I have a son at school, and I started volunteering when he was in pre-K. He's in first now, and just loved the school. I love being there. There's just so many positive things, especially now going on, and I just really wanted to help facilitate the positive change and help deal with the hard stuff and just be there for the community. Yeah.
Great.
Who's left? Sorry, I can't see everybody. Avelia.
Hey everyone, my name is Avelia Latino, and I was born and raised in Hood River. I also went to Hood River High. I've been in the board for 2 years now, and I joined the board because I have 2 sons at Mosier Community School. I also love the community within Mosier, and also a hopeful pathway for our Latino community to continue to reach out and also be present within school activities and board as well.
Thank you. Did we miss anybody? Anybody left? Did we get everybody? Okay.
You didn't? Did you
Is
do yours,
Robin?
Kristen?
Oh, me. Okay. Well, so I'm Kristen Miles. I'm the director of board development at OSBA. I've been there for a little over 8 years. I am also on a school board. I am on the Tiger Tualatin School Board. I am in my 2nd year there. And I went to high school in Salem, Oregon, in McKay, so I don't live very far from where I grew up. And I am on my school board to, as you all do, to give back to my community. Also, my sort of other reason is that I spent almost 8 years going around the state telling boards how to operate. And I felt like it was probably time to sit in that seat and actually feel what it was like to operate as a board member. So that's the other part of the reason why I'm there. And also I have a daughter in the district. So felt like I wanted to give back. Prior to being on that board, I was also on a charter school board. So I have been where you sit, and I have a very long history with charter schools, and not most, but at least half of my job at OSBA is doing charter stuff. And so all of the charter boards in Oregon, I'm the one that trains them. And I also help districts in their role as charter authorizers, doing evaluations, renewals, charter applications, anything that comes their way. So that's my job at OSBA too. Thank you for that. So our agenda, you have this on your agenda tonight. We're going to do some roles and responsibilities. We're going to talk about public meeting law a little bit. We're going to talk about policy updates and keeping up with policies and your questions around that. We're going to talk about fundraising. We're going to talk about board advocacy, and then whatever else that you want to cover. I've got some other little things in there I like to intersperse. And the other thing I just like to do a time check with you. We didn't talk about this explicitly. I know that we usually do 2 or 2.5 hours, something like that. How long do I have you tonight? What would you like?
Is it a comfortable time around 2 hours?
Around 2 hours? Okay, great. We will time it like that. So why does the board matter? And we've talked about this in the general sense, but particularly in charter schools, you are really that hub between your community and the school. You are much closer to your community than a district board member is. You are, for anybody who is a family member of somebody who's at the school, you are probably much, closer and in touch with the daily doings at the school, but you are really that hub, that go-between between the school and the community. And we know that the research tells us that boards impact students. All of the research says that boards impact students. And so we come into our board service as individual board members with our talents, with our thoughts, with our ideas, and that turns into board work. Then we work as a team, we work as a collective. The culture we create within our team spreads out, especially in charter schools, to the organizational culture. It is a much more distant relationship when you've got a big district, like say mine, but when you are in a small system, like a small district or a charter school, like you are really impacting the culture of the school because you're very connected and tightly connected down deep to the school. And that does impact, the research shows us, it impacts classroom instruction, which ultimately impacts students. And so, you know, I ask this to all boards, and I'm really asking this like in a different way now. Like, do you know who your students are and what their needs are? And how could you better know who your students are and what their needs are? So when you're sitting on the board, you're not in the classroom every single day, but in your relationship with your director and in your relationship as a board, how would you describe the population of students at your school and their needs? Like, what would you say to somebody like me who would ask you this question? Who are your kids? What are their needs? What might you say?
I think our kids are a lot alike many kids throughout the state. You know, we have the post-COVID kind of some issues with behavior that we're all working on. I think that's seen everywhere in the state. We have a range of kids that some are really high performers and some need help, you know. And I know you just even from my own kids, 3 different kids or 3 different places, you know, on the map. We know the kids through other interaction that we all do with the school. So we get opportunities to be around them, whether we're, you know, helping out with holiday fairs or any other fundraising issues, like fundraising events, we see them. So, but we know our kids also just through our interaction with the ED, with the staff, just as a small community, we
Oh, did we lose Dan?
Lost Dan.
Denise,
Yeah.
are you-
I would just add, I mean, one of the things that I always notice about the students and being in the school is that there's so much, like there's a really strong feeling of community and there's a lot of love and just really sweet humans in that school.
Mhm. Mhm. That's great. Anything else anybody wants to add?
I just want to say my internet is really unstable for some reason, so I keep cutting out. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
I would also add that the teachers are very close together and they work very cohesively as a family, which resembles into the students and into the environment you walk into. It's very warm and welcoming.
That's a great culture to create, a warm, welcoming, inviting culture to create at school. Thank you. We know from research, and this is research from districts and schools of all kinds, that there are practices that high performing boards who positively impact students practice. And so this is just sort of a chart of like aligned pieces of research that say the same thing. We know that boards who set vision and goals, that set clear expectations, that create that vision of high expectations for all of their students, and then set goals toward that vision, that has a positive impact on students. Climate and resources, then creating those conditions for success, and that can be providing staff development, that can be aligning your budget to the extent possible to your strategic priorities, sustaining those resources when you can, really looking at, does your allocation of resources, does your budget, do those meet the needs of your students? That's part of the reason we say, like, who are your students and what are their needs? Like, are you pointing your resources and your time toward your strategic priorities and the needs of your kids? Data and monitoring, like, what are you looking at? You know, when I say data, I don't just mean like state summative data, I mean information. What information does your school use to say, this is how we know kids are learning? This is how we know kids are doing well. It can also mean financial information. It can mean any kind of information that shows the health of your school and your system. And so holding the system accountable, which means monitoring progress. Like, what kind of information do you get to monitor the progress on your goals throughout the year? And then knowing what those things measure. and being, data savvy. The other really important piece, I talked about this at my board meeting at TTSD the other night, is that we have to embrace and look at all data, even if it's negative. We have to look at positive data. We have to look at negative data. We have to embrace the fact that there's room for improvement and there's reasons to celebrate. And we just have to acknowledge that all of those pieces exist because we don't have a full picture unless we do. Cohesive teaming, learning together as a board team. You're doing that tonight. You should do that in all kinds of other ways. There are many ways to do that. Going to conferences together, doing book studies, like any time, having retreats, anytime that you can do that team building piece, that's really important for the functioning of the board. And then practicing commitment to the vision of the school, practicing, unified governance doesn't mean uniform. It doesn't mean that you all come in thinking the same thing, because if there only needed to be one voice on the board, there would only need to be one board member. There needs to be multiple perspectives and multiple life experiences taken into account. But having that strong shared belief about students' abilities to succeed at whatever level that means to them. Community engagement. This is a really different thing in a charter school than it is in a district, right? Because you don't have a catchment area. Nobody's assigned to your school. Community engagement is about building that public will and that word of mouth and that, that constant desire for folks to keep attending your school. And it's connecting with the community and having the staff know who you are and what you do and what you don't do, and having the community know who you are and what you do. And then policy and accountability. Having policies that you can adapt. Not every policy that comes. Do you have OSBA policies? I think you do, don't you? Yeah. So some policies come to you with there's not a single word you can change on them, right? Because they come straight from statute. But there are others that you can modify, and having them have a focus on student learning and being focused on that higher level governance and not on operations, that is really important. And those are things that high performing boards do. And the things that have negative impacts on student outcomes, right? Meetings are less orderly, there's less respect on the board, some individuals take up all the airtime where others don't talk at all. Less time is spent talking about student learning. There's just other stuff that boards talk about, and less focus is on students. Looking to advance folks' own agendas. I mean, I deal with boards all over the state, and there are some board members that get on the board because they want to fire a certain teacher or a certain principal, right? And that's an agenda. Wanting to advance student learning or wanting to see a really comprehensive math curriculum, that's not a specific agenda. That is that's a strong interest, but members wanting to advance their own agendas, that's pretty specific. Obviously, less effective working relationships is going to be detrimental. Less reliance on the administrator as an educational leader, that has negative impacts on students. So you hired an executive director to be your educational lead, and having less reliance on that person to be your educational lead is detrimental to the health of the school. And then less focus on that governance piece. Being only vaguely aware of what's going on at school, only vaguely aware of improvements, of initiatives, or making excuses like, if only we didn't have those kids, or if only this happened, or if only that happened, we can't get every kid across the line. Having external excuses, we cannot control every situation that every kid faces coming into our system. But there's a difference between saying, okay, we acknowledge that we can't control everything, but what can we do to wrap our arms around them? There's a difference between that and saying, if only they didn't show up at our door, which we've probably heard, which, we hear, and that being detrimental to students. Micromanagement, we talk a lot about that. Don't get into the weeds. When staff don't know what the board does and what it doesn't do. And then those anecdotes and personal experiences, I had a bad interaction with a teacher, therefore all of my decisions are going to be based on my one interaction with this person instead of making systems decisions. So that governance and management piece, just big picture, right? You do policy, your executive director does the implementation of that policy and administrative regulations where those need to be developed, the articulation of those policies. You adopt a budget and then your staff gets to spend it, right? Within the budget confines, you probably look at it a lot more than a district does because you are much more tightly woven as a charter school into the financial operations of the charter school than a district usually is. You adopt programs and then program implementation happens at the staff level. You adopt curriculum and curriculum recommendations probably come to you up through the staff and director level. That's my guess. That's usually how that happens is there's like a committee out here that looks at curriculum and then brings a recommendation to the board as far as what is to be adopted. But in the end, you adopt curriculum. Community engagement happens on both sides. I don't know, maybe I don't know if the board is responsible for certain kinds of community engagement, like events over the course of the year, or like whether the board, like whether you throw a big festival or you have an auction or something like that. But, there are certain kinds of community engagement the board does. Then there's the on the ground community engagement every day that your staff and that your management do. And then there's that informed oversight monitoring piece. We want you to have enough information that you know how to do these big decisions. And yet we don't want you, micromanaging. And your staff is going to bring you that data and information that you need in order to make those big decisions. So there's this wonderful balance between, we talk a lot, and I've probably talked to you a lot in the past about, not that micromanagement piece being dangerous, being detrimental. You don't want to be in the weeds and you don't want to be doing the daily work. And if there are ever tough times that you've faced on the board where there has been instability on staff, it is hard to pull yourselves back from that. But you want to still remain at that policy, that big decision level. But on the other hand, you also don't want to be a rubber stamp board, right? You don't want to get into a position where you're like, okay, whatever the administration says, that's what we do. And because you want enough information to have informed oversight where you've got an appropriate amount of information that you can have a good discussion between yourselves and between you and your executive director to have to make good decisions, because that's what you're there to do. You're there to make smart, good decisions. So how do we get there? There is a piece of research that tells us that the single belief shared by all board members that every student can learn, just learn, not achieve at any sort of level on a test, but that all students can learn, that belief shared by all board members measurably impacts student outcomes. And, we think of why that would be, but when you think of the opposite, like if not everybody believed that, if there was a belief that, not every student can really learn, then that changes the way we make decisions. It changes how we want to allocate our resources. It changes what kind of programs we want to implement at school. It changes the way that we want to, spend our time thinking about professional development. It changes potentially what curriculum we want to adopt, certainly what programs we want to implement. It changes the way that we think about our kids and the way that we make decisions. And so when every board member believes that all students can learn, just learn, we are positively impacting students. And so I'm not sure if I've showed this to you before, or if I have, it's probably been a while. There's a lot of research out there that shows that boards make a difference. And prior to the year 2000, there was really an assumption that boards did not make a difference. There's like a number of papers out there that I have read that are like, boards should go away. They should just be abolished. They just sit at the top of the system and they just, they do whatever, but we don't need them. All we need, are principals and classroom teachers. That's it. Those are the only people that, and that there was just this whole anti-board movement. And there was a project called the Lighthouse Inquiry that really just asked the question, are we sure that boards don't make a difference? And it really showed that boards do, that the way that boards, that the characteristics and behaviors of boards actually make a difference in student outcomes. And that was very exciting in the world of board governance, which is small, but a lot of researchers kept replicating those studies and kept going out and doing research, and the answers just kept coming back again and again. Yes, boards make a difference. And so a researcher named Dr. Tom Alsbury, who has spent his entire career studying board governance and has really come up with 12 research-based standards that we teach from, and that when boards are performing toward these standards, not getting them perfect because we don't set you up for failure, but that when boards are performing toward these standards, you are going to be measurably impacting student outcomes. And so the first of these is vision directed planning. And that is really doing that, like that strategic focus, that what do we want for our students? Like, what do we see for our kids while they're in our system and then after they leave? And engaging the community in that, engaging staff in that, engaging families in that, and having that vision for student outcomes. Community engagement, that is highly dependent on your school and your community, what that means, what that looks like, but being invested in doing community engagement and having collaborative partnerships, that's important too. Your effective leadership, part of that is aligning your authority so that your staff and your administration can go do their job while you know what your job is over here, so that decisions can be made at their most local level. But that is also about understanding that you make big decisions and being an empowered board and being, leading with comfort and leading with authority. And, having that balance, not being that rubber stamp board and also not being that micromanaged board, having that, that effective, that knowledge base that allows you to make those big decisions. And then accountability, that's about monitoring. That is having high expectations for every student, but then how do you monitor those expectations? So if you've got a strategic plan, or if you've got strategic goals or big school goals, how do you get information along the way to know that the school is making progress on those goals? Do you have that mapped out on a calendar throughout the year, where it would say, okay, in January, we're going to get this kind of information. In March, we get this kind of information. Like, how do you plan for updates and reports that are going to tell you this is how we're progressing along these goals, so that you can hold the system accountable for that and plan for that? So I'm going to stop there for a second and say, so as you look at these, are there any of these that you feel like you do particularly well?
I feel like our community engagement is pretty good. I think that we have a number of events throughout the year that bring people together. And most recently, we had a work party for our playground that was really cool. We saw lots of people show up for that. So it was really nice to see that, that engagement that we didn't see as much of that in years past, but it was really nice to see that happen this year and just about a month ago.
Nice.
I think we've made a lot of really wonderful progress in the effective leadership arena. And I think that we're pretty well aligned with that direction, and folks understand roles and responsibilities across, from staff, executive director, and the board. I think you're probably also going to ask us if we have areas to improve.
Yes.
Okay, I'll pause then.
Any other thing that you feel like you're doing particularly well?
I think that, you know, the effective leadership, I think, is moving in a really positive direction. I think that, you know, this board, I think, is an empowering one. And I think that we've made a point of bringing in the community and staff to give their opinions and weigh their thoughts in. And you know, I think that it's you can see it in the school, and that, you know, I think folks feel a sense of you know, value in what they know and what they're good at. And it's really nice to be on this board. And I think that that is something that this board, the culture of this board, I think is a collaborative one. And I think that schools, you know, I think collaboration is very important in a school setting. And I think that when there is a collaborative spirit, you know, everybody kind of rises up, and great things can happen. So, yeah, we also have areas of improvement. However, I think that that is something really special.
What would you, is there anything here then, let me move to that you would seek to improve?
Well, you know, we're definitely already in discussion about, you know, our vision directed planning, which is in, you know, something that we have to address. And also, you know, I think everyone is very excited about the work and bringing in all stakeholders. So it's an area of improvement. And I think it's also one that everyone is excited to, you know, dip their feet into. And then,
Can I add on that one really quick, Marie, just to add a perspective? I think that because that was the first one that jumped out to me as far as where we can improve as well. And in just thinking about it, it seems like that we have been working on a vision for the last couple year or so. It just hasn't been down in writing. It's been that vision of like, let's get stable. Let's, you know, find an executive director to really take us to the next level. And those things we have implemented and we've had great successes with. It's just that next piece of, okay, so now what is our formal strategic plan and how are we going to get there? And that's, I think, where we're starting that endeavor right now. But yeah, we have a lot of room to go, or a lot of work to do still. Sorry, I just wanted to add that on that one.
yeah, I think, yeah, just getting it down, and then, you know, going even further, like Emily just said. And then I think in general, this board will have to work on setting up a way so that future boards can just step in. I think we all agree that this board has that work. And, you know, I think we're going to be discussing, you know, what program could we possibly use so that we can have all of our documents, you know, archived, and what can we do so that, you know, future board members and admin, when they need to access documents, just go to one place. And also, how can we relieve the way that, you know, we post meet, it's a bit cumbersome, I think, on the executive secretary, who has to, you know, work with our sponsoring district to get the links and so how can we simplify the process? And that's something that stands out to me. And then I'll let others speak.
Anything else before we move to the next 4?
I'd like to see long-term some more just accountability measures as a board, you know, like what the, you know, kind of, I know it's in our calendar as far as when we get state testing and things like that to see where we're at, but kind of focus on that a bit more. I think it's important for us also to, you know, just to vocalize that we've been through quite a bit over the last few years.
Mhm.
So we're to the point now where we have the energy and time to say, okay, we can work on our strategic plan with our ED. We can work on these things and work on not just staying alive, right? Work on all the other things that need to happen. And so we're to that point now and where we can take a training like this and you know, find some goals that we want to really be able to achieve over the next couple of years. And it's great to be there now. So I just wanted to make that point.
That's great. So let's look at the next 4. The next one is using data, and that really is connected to that accountability piece. So then what is the information that you would use to do that monitoring, that accountability? And this is about using data from multiple sources. And again, data means information, but you know, one of the things that I always say is, you know, I don't know any school or district that wants to just identify themselves by the state test, right? It's like, what is it that your school measures to know that your kids are learning? And do you know what that is? Do you know what those kinds of things are that measure? And how do you talk to your ED about that? What kind of information do you get to say, this is how we know kids are learning? And usually, you know, in my experience, like, you know, staff and management and admin folks are usually really excited to talk about, like, here's how we know our kids are learning. But that using that data to monitor progress and improvement. Cultural responsiveness, recognizing that diversity comes in so many different forms, and reducing and eliminating barriers to access for kids for all of our programs, applying multiple perspectives and different perspectives before making big decisions. We work with a lot of districts and schools to develop equity lenses. You can call them whatever you want, but that, you know, set of questions to say, like, who is this decision benefiting? Who is it negatively impacting? Who was at the table for this decision? Like, what are some unintended consequences? But using that, using diverse perspective to look at policy and programs and big decisions like budget. Culture and climate, really looking at creating that positive climate. You mentioned this in the beginning, that there is that positive climate at school, that welcoming positive climate that folks are creating, that can be also supported by policies and practices at the board level. Part of that is modeling professional and respectful relationships that you do, having those relationships with your ED, and supporting practices that do that for kids as well. And then being a learning organization, understanding that, you know, everybody's learning all the time, that you expect professional development from your staff, you do it for yourself, you know, there's a continuous improvement cycle, but that you're also reflecting on what you do well, which is why I start this, you know, with this, like, what do you do well here? Because in education, we don't look enough at what we do well. We don't, you know, we tend to always be like, what do we need to improve, which is great, but we should also be leveraging our strengths. But doing that reflection, that discovery, that improvement, and recognizing that everyone can lead from where they sit. And so that, you know, staff and anybody, volunteers, anybody at all levels can be a leader in your system, and recognizing that and nurturing that. Okay, the same question. Anything in this group of 4 that you feel like is going well, that you feel like you do well?
Do Tiffany or
School as
Avilia
a
want to add?
whole. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Emily.
I was just going to try to pull out Tiffany or Avilia because we haven't heard from them. But maybe they don't have anything to add right now. Nope. Go for it, Dan.
the learning organization, I think, is, it's definitely embraced at the school level. You see a lot of teacher development days, and they bring in a lot of people to help, boost that continuous learning. And I think this board has done a good job of reaching out and trying to set up these board learning training days so that we can continue to learn more about what it means to do this job. So I think that, there's always room for improvement there, but I feel like that's something that we all embrace and we all want to do. We look forward to, learning more about what our obligations are as a board member. And you see that at the school as well. It's one of the, a big part of our yearly calendar is those PD days.
That's great. Anything else? Okay, let me ask what you would improve, if anything.
I think one of the things that I would say that we could improve is our communication. Not necessarily that we're not doing a good work in communication, but I guess it's more of in one of the board meetings, we talked about reaching out to our bilingual families and having some type of translator and just reaching out that continuously and seeing like for different events or for different meetings or for different needs that the school's needing, just to be able to clearly make sure that communications are clearly being read or understood. I guess it's more of understood, just because we don't know what the fluency skills of each of what the family's fluency skills can be. So I think that's one of the areas that I think we can improve, and making sure that we do actually follow a plan where we are reaching out and we are getting more of that cultural responsiveness, being a little bit more proactive on that aspect.
Great. Anything else before we move to the last four? Okay. Last four. Systems thinking. Thinking of your school as a whole system, not just a collection of parts. Now, in a smaller system, this is a little more difficult, but when you're doing systems thinking, one thing you're not doing is taking a problem over here and moving it over here, right? You are saying, how could a problem over here impact the rest of the system? But you're also saying, how could something going really well over here be leveraged to impact the rest of the system in a positive way? And it's also about seeking out other partnerships and leveraging resources from or leveraging knowledge from other partners or relationships that you have. Innovation and creativity is the fun one, thinking about problems in new ways. We all had the opportunity to do that a few years ago when we all went remote and everything was, we governed differently, we managed differently, we taught differently, but thinking about old problems in new ways or just differently, and doing that together as a board, and deciding that, that within the confines of your roles and the laws which, bind you, what are the different kinds of ways in which you can approach something? And maybe that's wrapping in other partners too, to help you think creatively. That next one, board member conduct, ethics, and relationship with your director, that is your roles and responsibilities. That's governance and management, like we talked about in the beginning, having those clear lines of, what your job is, what it's not. And then budgeting and financial accountability, being good stewards of the money to the extent possible, aligning your resources with your strategic goals, with that vision that you have for the school, with, those things that you're tracking and monitoring, and ensuring that the school is financially sound, which again, you are probably a little bit closer to the action than a district is, because you're also managing a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So you've got to, at all times, make sure that that is financially sound. Anything here that resonates with you as going particularly well?
for sure the budgeting and financial accountability, just being new, but seeing where the school is, like I think the board has done, and I think we will continue to do a really good job managing those funds and making sure things that they need what they need in the school, they get what they need, and having excess to save for a rainy day or when things come up. From what it appears, like I said, I haven't been into it too much yet, but it seems to me that that is a real strength, and I hope that we're set up, it seems, to continue with that, especially with our new ED. She's really on it, and yeah, I think that's something that's going really well for the board.
Awesome.
I think in regards to the third one there, the relationships with director, last year was, a challenge in having an interim director, but it was also, a positive relationship where we got to get in and probably do more work as a board than you normally would, but also be there as a support structure for our interim ED and for our vice principal, just as we went through the year with, having an interim, somebody who's not familiar with the school culture or just the history of the school, it was a challenge that I think we did well at last year. There were various challenges that came up throughout the year, but we used that as a stabilization year. And then our new ED, is just, it's great to have her there and have a shared sense of direction with where the school should go and respect for all staff. And it's really working well. And it's nice to be able to be supportive and just be there for whatever she needs.
That's great. Yeah. What would you want to work on if you had anything, if anything?
Oh, go ahead, Marie.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, not that we're not doing this as a board, but for myself as an individual board member, I think the systems thinking is something that I want to spend more time learning about and, just kind of thinking on, because there's so much to learn. So the piece on collaborative local, state, and national partnerships and coordinated programs, I feel like there's probably a lot out there that I don't even know about, and you don't know what you don't know. So I can't systems think on it if I don't know what it is.
Right.
And so that's one that I personally would like to spend some time just researching more about what is out there and where we could be collaborating, where we're not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also feel the same way about that, Emily, and I think it's evident to anybody that joins a school board or spends time in a public school that, grants need to be solicited. Somebody's got to write them and apply for them, and you begin to realize quickly that there's probably just so much out there. But yeah, it needs to be, we have to know about it, and so we have to ask ourselves and do the research. And so yeah, I would say the systems thinking, I feel like it's probably just a work in progress. It's just something, things are always changing, new programs are always being developed, and it's, I think, what can make being a board member very interesting at the same time, because you can really, if you follow what's happening at the legislative level,
Yeah.
state what's happening, and then try to find the resources that are related to those new measures. And so anyhow,
Right. Yeah.
I think innovation and creativity, this board has been, I would say, quite proficient, and will probably continue as in any small school district. You have to think outside of the box to try to get what you need.
Yeah. That's great. Those those are the 12. Those are the things that when you're working toward those things, you're having a positive impact on students. And so sometimes they come kind of easy, and sometimes there are things that you want to set up for working on more. But those are the things that positively impact your students at the board level. There is some brand new research that shows that doing some of these things particularly impact your director's leadership. And so 3 of those standards: community engagement, using data, that was standard 5, community engagement was standard 2, and cultural responsiveness, standard 6. When you're doing those well, you are positively impacting your director's leadership. So the research was about transformational leadership. And the reason this study was on transformational leadership is that's the one that most school leaders and superintendents identify with as their style of leadership. And there are 4 components of that. One of them is inspirational motivation. And the study showed that when the board is doing things well in those 3 standards, the more likely the superintendent or school leader is to be high in inspirational motivation, is more likely to be an inspirational leader for their staff. And so those are directly related to your leaders' leadership abilities and to be an inspirational motivator to your staff. So another reason to really pay attention to those standards. So what does that look like? What can community engagement look like? That can look like advisory committees. That can look like administrative and teachers involving families in, in advisory things that come before you, or strategic decision making. We talked about that. Using data for continuous improvement is multiple sources of high quality data that come to you. Looking at growth metrics and, again, how do you know that your kids are learning? Looking at growth throughout the year and not just summative measures. Data that shows gaps and opportunities, like where are the gaps in how your students are doing, then what are the kinds of things that can be done. Now, you're not going to pick out strategies because you're the board, but knowing what the gaps are can help you allocate resources and also help you make strategic decisions. And then cultural responsiveness, celebrating the diversity of your students, ensuring that students see themselves in your curriculum, using an equity lens or whatever you want to call it to overlay the big decisions that you make. That's what those things can look like. So I want to practice a couple of scenarios. I also want to make sure that we hit exactly what you want to talk about. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to skip scenarios and I'm going to go to make sure that we hit what you want to talk about. And if we have time, we'll come back to some of the fun scenarios. I know you wanted to talk about public meetings law. And so the kinds of things that we hit on that are about communication outside meetings, email, text, and social media, and public records. And so I'm going to talk for a little bit about each of those, but I want to make sure, well, actually, before I talk about any of those, what do you have specific questions that you would want answered as part of this discussion? Or areas that are sticky for you? Tiffany.
Sorry, I couldn't get unmuted. So if we have multiple board members that want to be on the PTA and attend those meetings, can they do so if there's more than, say there was a quorum, because it's not a meeting specific to that and we're not making specific decisions, or how does that,
Is the PTA a separate organization? Is it its own organization? Like, how is the PTA set up?
Separate from the board? Yes. I mean, they're 2 different,
right.
Yeah. So it's a PTA, or we call it Tiger's Den. And it is its own, yes, and not all members or board members necessarily are on it. Or maybe they actually might all be, but not all of us ever go to the meetings, or not that I've seen since being on the board. So I'm just, yeah, could we, or if we show up and there's a quorum of us, does someone have to wait, or how does that work?
I would, well, and the reason I asked how is it set up, because sometimes, and let me put out my disclaimer before anything else, I'm not an attorney, so I can't give legal advice. So everything I'm saying, none of this should be legal advice. But sometimes there are PTAs, well, it's not PTA because that's an organization in and of itself. PTOs, whatever, parent groups that are set up as like their own like 501c3s. This is not that. Okay. Because
I don't
sometimes
think so.
sometimes it makes it easier if that's a separate organization for board members to be involved with that, because like that's just a separate organization. And if you're involved with that or on the board of that, like that's just not even related. But in this case, I think I would avoid having a quorum of you there because it is more it's not, there is not that clear line. And as you know, I've probably said this to you over the years, like OSBA is always going to be risk averse on your behalf because we don't want you to get in trouble.
Yeah.
But I would avoid having a quorum of you there, A, for perception, B, because it's just easy to get into a chat about something that you might be talking about upcoming or have talked about before. And you just wouldn't want to get into a space where anybody could call into question you having an illegal board meeting, because all of that stuff has now moved over, like the accountability for that has now moved over to the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, which does have teeth in it now, and you can be fined. So you want to avoid, you want to avoid any perception of violating public meeting law. So I would really avoid having a quorum of you in a meeting like that.
Yeah, and so that's a distinction that I was just wanting to ask you. So, for instance, we do community events and we have all of the board members are also parents. And so we'll all show up for those, or like
Yep.
the work party we did. A lot of board members were present there. And I'm assuming that that's a-okay because we're not talking about board content. We are participating as parents and just in a community engagement type of situation. So,
Yeah.
and we talked about that before as far as like social
Yeah.
time together. Like the board can get together and have social time and not talk about
Correct.
board. Like do not mention the word board or anything that has to do with our work here.
Correct. Yeah.
And so it seems like the line could be harder to hold in a PTO meeting, but it's still possibly, I mean, it still could be held if everybody is very practiced.
I think, if you're at a PTA meeting, you're talking about things that are relevant to the school and you're talking about school matters. So I think it would be, if we all end up at the MoCo outside, kids are running around, it's a lot easier to just not talk about school, right? But as soon as you enter a meeting to talk about, fundraising for the school, what we're going to build, I think it's just probably very difficult to navigate.
Yeah, that brings up a good point too, Marie, because is the Tiger's Den sort of like a board committee almost, given that we have the fundraising committee and that's kind of where that work happens?
Well, I know that the meetings are now posted as public meetings and minutes are being taken. So I think that that's covering the basis for it to be a fun, for one of our board members to be the chair of that fundraising committee. I don't know, Kristen, if you can speak to that. One of our board members is the chair of the fundraising committee, and she is organizing the PTA meetings. However, the PTA meetings are being posted as public meetings and minutes are being taken. So it's a board-led committee, right?
So the key to whether or not the committee needs to follow public meeting law is if the committee makes direct recommendations to the board. So if the committee itself regardless of who's chairing it and regardless of whether board members are on it or not, if that committee has the power to come to the board and make direct recommendations to the board, that committee needs to follow public meeting law. If the recommendations come through your ED and your ED has the power to change that recommendation, like if the recommendation comes to your ED and your ED is like, I'm going to modify this before I bring it to the board, then that committee does not have to follow, because that's an administrative committee at that point. But if that committee is making direct recommendations to the board, then that is that committee follows public meeting law. And so it sounds like that committee is following public meeting law.
But it's also maybe not really a board committee. I mean, we have it set up that way right now, but the financial committee doesn't make, or at least I haven't seen them make recommendations to the board.
What do they do?
I
Who
think
do they
over
make
time,
recommendations to?
I think it's going to weave back and forth depending on what the project is. So I think sometimes it may be an ED thing where the ED is like, well, we can work on this, you know, if it comes to like, okay, how are we going to work on the swing sets or the playground? She's directly involved in that. But I think other times when you say, oh, we're going to do a turkey trot, that's brought to the board. Like parents are organizing it. We're aware of it. I don't know. I think it goes back and forth. I think if it's just publicly noticed, like it's been done, and then minutes are taken and posted, I think you cover your bases. And then, you know, whether it's viewed either way, it's covered.
Yeah.
And then we should just make sure that we don't end up in a quorum.
Yeah, regardless of, you know, whether or not, yeah, you don't want to be in a quorum. So if it's going to be a committee, you still don't want a quorum, because if you have a quorum, that's just a full board meeting at that point. It's not a committee anymore. It's just a board meeting.
So question for you on that one then. We have a small school and a smaller group of parents who are, you know, for one reason or another can participate in that type of thing, the Tiger's Den. And so we've got a lot, I haven't looked at the list recently, but we probably have a lot of our board members on the email list that shares information. And so is it an issue if folks are on the list getting information and not responding? Or is the potential like running meeting or whatever we call that only if all the board members or a quorum of board members are responding to the emails?
You can get information. That's okay. You can receive information. You just don't want to hit reply all and start talking. Yeah.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah. So that's great. Those are good targeted questions. Do you want me to talk about like email, text, social media, that communication outside meetings, those public records, those pieces that are general public meeting law pieces? Would that be helpful? Or do you feel like you have those covered? What would you like? Or did you have just those specific questions?
For me, I think I always try when I'm sending emails out to blind copy all the board members if it's a board thing, so that if they're responding, it's only to me and not to each other. You know, usually that has to do with setting up meetings and anything we're talking about as far as setting up a meeting. So I understand the email side. Texting, yeah, I would say the same thing. If something goes out, I may send a text to everybody that says, hey, I sent you an email, please check your emails, or whatever it is, but it's not a reply back thing. I think everyone seems to understand that pretty well and follows good, you know, order on that. So the social media side is run by the school.
Okay.
So we don't run that as a board.
Right. You don't want to get a quorum of you talking on social media, right? Like you don't want to. There are, I don't know if you've ever had issues with social media, but there are times in certain schools where like folks will try to sort of, you know, tag board members and bait them into a conversation, and then that'll get going. And, you know, you don't want to get a quorum of you, or you just don't want to, you don't want to engage really in social media stuff, because that can be a real slippery slope. But like, you don't want to get a quorum of you talking on social media. The thing about public records that I like to remind everybody is that even if we are operating well within the bounds of public meeting law, we are always creating public records. no matter what, when we are performing in our board role. So you can get a public records request for anything and everything, like along a certain subject or whatever. Whether or not you would need to disclose everything would be a matter for an attorney, right? Like if you got a big old public records request for something, you would want to talk to your school's attorney, have them go through it, redact, there may be some stuff that needs to be redacted, or there may be some stuff that, an attorney would be like, you don't have to release this. That would be a legal question. But it's just important to remember that we should watch our tone even, and the kinds of things that we say, to each other or to other people. I mean, when you send an email to me, you're creating a public record. OSBA follows public meeting laws and public records laws as well. And so when I send information out, I'm monitoring this too, but just as it's a good reminder that we are always creating public records in our role as board members, even if we are always staying within public meeting laws. So that's important to know. So anything else on public meeting law, public records? Any other questions that are specific or general on that? Okay. I do want to let you know that there are a couple, you don't have to read all these, but there are a couple of new, let me back up, executive sessions as part of public meeting law. There are a couple of new reasons that you can go into executive session. So just to let you know, these are all the current reasons. These are all the old reasons, and you may be familiar with these. You can, they're on our website. You can look them up. I can send this to you so you have it as a resource. But in the last full legislative session, they put in two more reasons that you can go into executive session. One is to consider matters relating to the safety of the governing body and public body staff and volunteers, and the security of public body facilities and meeting spaces. So as you might remember, as we came back from COVID and in a couple years following, around the country, there were a lot of threats to boards, and there was a lot of upheaval in board meetings, and threats of violence and stuff like that. And that happened in Oregon. Boards felt unsafe, community members felt unsafe, staff felt unsafe. And so boards can now go into executive session to discuss safety plans for if something like that happens at a board meeting, or to secure public body facilities and meeting spaces. So you can plan for something like that. So you could do that in executive session. And the next one is to consider matters relating to cybersecurity infrastructure and responses to cybersecurity threats. So as we have more of those and more problems with those, you can go into executive session to discuss those things, because you don't want to be discussing your vulnerabilities in that way in public. So that is the other new reason you can go into executive session now. Any questions on executive session in general or in specific? Okay. Let me come back to this if we need to. I'm going to skip scenarios for
Could
now.
we go back to those ones really quick?
The conflicts of interest?
Yep. My husband is employed by the school now, and he wasn't last time we chatted.
Okay.
It might just
All
be
right.
helpful.
Conflicts of interest. This is straight from the OGEC. So conflicts of interest. We'll go over potential and actual. So here's, and again, straight from the Oregon Government Ethics Commission scenarios, which are great. So here's a scenario. A school district is constructing a new elementary school and is developing criteria for the construction. Oh, it says bid. It should say bid. I'm sorry. Bid process. A board member's son owns a construction company in town. What would create a potential conflict of interest? Any idea there?
If the son put in a bid on the project.
Close. If the participating officials developed the bid criteria. So if the participating official is like sitting in a board meeting and helping develop the bid criteria, because eventually that could financially impact her son. Doesn't yet, but developing the criteria for an eventual solicitation could potentially one day impact. So can she participate in that? Yes. Should she declare a potential conflict of interest? Yes. But when you declare a potential conflict of interest, you can still participate, you can still vote. But you declare it so that it's out there, it's in public, everybody's aware of what the scenario is. And you can declare, like, some people like to over declare potential conflicts of interest. If they're like, this just, I just want to do this for public perception, I'm just going to declare a potential conflict of interest because it doesn't change the way that I act. It may not even be necessary, but I'm just going to say it because of perception reasons. I might have a conflict of interest here. And it's better to over declare than to under declare. So that could create a potential conflict of interest. So the next scenario would be the school district is now soliciting bids for the construction of the school. And there are 4 qualified bids, and the school board will be awarding the contract to one of the 4 bidders at the upcoming meeting. One of the qualified bids was submitted by the school board member's son. What would create an actual conflict of interest?
If that member participates in the selection.
Yes. Participating in the vote to award the bid would, because the effect of her decision would have a financial impact, either positive or negative, on the son's construction company, right?
Question really quick.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The financial impact on the family member is what creates the conflict of interest. And that is because Tiffany's brother-in-law is at the school now too. So we've got a family, it's a small community. How far out do you go with family members?
So it's anybody, it is, I think brother-in-law is included. There's a list of these at OGEC. There are some weird things that are excluded. I think like cousin is excluded, but like anybody that you've got, anybody of member of the household, regardless of relation, anybody that you have got any sort of liability for, regardless of relation, all kinds, I think in-laws are included, anybody that is a direct and close family member is included, even if they don't live with you. It is pretty broad. It sweeps pretty broadly. What I will say is that the OGEC is a really great resource before you run in, like before a situation happens, right? Like if you know that you're going to be facing a situation like this and you're like, does this relative count? And like, would I declare a conflict of interest? Because they are the regulatory body for all of this stuff. So whatever they say goes anyway. Like I said, OSBA is always going to be like risk averse on your behalf. But since they're the ones that would fine you or investigate, if you call them and say, could I participate? And they said yes, then you just could. It's like getting legal advice, right? Like you just could. And but they could also tell you, well, here are the relatives that count. And they're really wonderful, they're really responsive, and then they give the final answer. And so if you ran into a scenario that you knew you were going to run into, what I will say is you want to ask them before you deal with it, or else you are reporting yourself if you run into it afterwards. But yes, and especially in a small community, these kinds of things happen all the time, right? And so good things to look out for. So thank you for stopping me on that one, because
thank you. Not to take everybody's time, but I was just curious.
No. I mean, again, like this is your time. If you're seeing something that I'm skipping, like let's go back and talk about it. Okay.
Emily, do you want to elaborate any more on that? Do you have any other questions? I'm fine with, just to make sure that you have any of those questions answered.
I don't have any.
Like for me, it comes up.
Yeah.
With contract negotiation next year,
Yep.
And then at some point we'll have to vote on a new contract. It directly affects your family and Tiffany's, brother-in-law, obviously. So there's some gray area there. I think just reaching out and, like Kristen says, for guidance would be the right path when we get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, just based off of what Kristen just said, it kind of doesn't sound like there's gray area on that type of thing, right? Because that's like a contract that's directly going to impact our family member financially. So that would be one that doesn't seem like a potential. It seems more like a
There is, so, and this is what OGEC can help with too. If you've got a family member who is like a teacher, say, and you're approving like a swath of teacher contracts or the collective bargaining agreement or
Mhm.
something like that altogether.
Mhm.
There is what do they call it? A class exception. Or a class or a size exception, something where they're like, look, if this group of individuals is big enough, like we're not going to stop a board member from making a decision on this because the group of individuals is so big and the person that we're worried about is just one of this huge group. You can participate in that decision.
Mhm.
But there is no hard and fast rule for when that group becomes small enough. So that is where, like, especially, if there is, a group size, I mean, that is where they would need to weigh in and say, I mean, if it's an individual contract, certainly that would be
Yeah.
likely, an actual conflict of interest. But if it's like a group of folks, then you're taking all of it at once and you're like approving FTE and you've got, like 5 FTE and like you've got, one person who's part of that FTE that you're related to. Like, I don't know if there would be a class exception for that, but that's something that OGEC would be able to help with.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's helpful. And thank you for pointing me in that direction. I'm happy to do like research on my own offline just so that I have a really clear compass. And yeah, Dan, that was one of the things that popped into my head too, thinking, oh, I'm not going to help next year with the contract negotiations like I did this last year because it feels too close. But I will look into OGEC's stuff that they've got.
I will say that I work at OSBA. OSBA stuff comes before boards all the time. Like we are always voting on who the board members are going to be or OSBA initiatives and stuff. And even though there is no direct financial implications on me or anybody else, I don't vote on any of it, right? Like I talk about it openly. I'm like, I'm an employee there. I'm not touching any of this, right? And so like I overuse it, which I may not have to, but there's a perception piece as well that I'm not telling you not to participate. I'm really not. But like one of the considerations, especially in a small community, may be perception. It's just one of those things that you may want to consider. So.
Thank you. I'll look into it too. Dan brought it up already, but I was thinking as Emily talked about this and you said maybe sister-in-law would count for the contract thing. So thank you.
I can see where this could be tricky if we don't have all board members present when a vote needs to happen. And so I think we just, when it comes down to it, we should contact OGC and just make sure, say, hey, here's our situation. What are the parameters that we can follow so that we make sure that we don't stall, contract talks or board work because of this issue. If we get a clear direction from them, then we can move forward and then we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Good. Thanks for stopping me on that. Let's talk about policy for a second. So tell me we can certainly talk about updating policies, timelines for this, how to not get swamped. What are your main questions and topics around policy? I can help guide that discussion.
Some of those, reached out to Michelle to see if we had received, because they're supposed to go to the ED and she has not received any policy updates. We have a subscription service, so I need to reach out and find out what's going on there. And one of our past board members, Sad, may have some more information on that, but we should be receiving regular updates that we can incorporate into our meetings. I would assume are they all flooded in at one time during the year or a couple times during the year, or
Yeah.
or do we see them throughout the year?
So they come out like quarterly. I know that policy update, so Spencer Lewis is our director of policy, and we just had a meeting today, and he is hoping to get it out in the next week or two. It will be probably pretty big. And then at certain times throughout the year, they collect them, they put them together. It is always driven by whatever the State Board of Ed is doing and whatever the legislature is doing, because law and administrative rules are what drives the change in our policies. And sometimes, while we're working on those changes anyway, we may make some recommended changes to like some best practice policies, like in your B section policies, which are your board behavior policies. Those change every once in a while based on best practices, based on what we see in the field, based on research. And while we're doing policy update anyway, we may recommend some changes to those, but those aren't going to come out piecemeal. It's all going to come out in like, yep, you're a subscriber. Here's your link to policy update. There are 25 policies here, or whatever. I think you'll see something in the next couple of weeks. I think that's the plan. And then, after the big legislative, I don't know if they've got more between now and the end of the legislative session, because that'll be a while. But certainly after the next legislative session, it will probably be pretty big, because after every legislative session, it's enormous. Although it takes us some time to fully absorb what all of the changes are, how those policies are implicated. But I do know that we've got one coming out very soon.
Okay. Then on your, do you mind if I just keep going for a minute here on this?
Absolutely.
So on your readings, your first reading, second reading, and adoption, are you, with your board, sending all those things out and having them read them and then bringing it up in the meeting and saying that you have had your first reading, or do you read it out loud in the meeting? I'm just wondering, as far as time usage, like we have some policies that are pretty long, and if we're going to need to read them aloud in two consecutive meetings and then adopt it in the third meeting, is that the way we're supposed to approach it, or is it here's the posted policies that's been in our packet or whatever, and and take questions based on that? How do you approach that?
So I know it's tougher when you've got a smaller board, and this is a lot of hands-on work. On my board, we have a policy committee, and superintendent is on it when he can be. We've got critical staff on it, which I know, again, this is a big system, but there are 2 board members on it, and I am one of those. And what we do is take a stab at the recommendations that come before the board for first reading. And we go through them with a fine-tooth comb, and we look at all the bracketed language, and we, look at all the new required language and the redacted language, and make all of the recommended changes. And then those go into the board packet for the first reading. Everybody's got an opportunity to look at those, but they know that those have gone through a committee vetting process first. And so first reading is, does anybody have any questions or changes to the committee work that has been done? And sometimes they're like, I don't know about this language, but then we discuss that thing instead of doing line edits, because those have been done as part of the committee work. And if there is discussion, it's about like, I don't know about this substantive change that was made in the bracketed language, or what you're recommending, or whatever. And so sometimes there's discussion, sometimes there's not. But if there are any changes to be made, we just take them back, bring them back for the next meeting. Second reading is usually just vote, or it's usually part of the consent agenda, because if nobody's got any changes, or there are very few changes in the first reading, we stick them into the consent agenda for second reading. And so the lion's share of that work is done in committee.
So that's kind of like Thad was basically acting as our committee, more or less, right? He was like going through them all, and then he came to us and said, okay, here are the things I want to point out to everyone. And that reading, and the reading isn't like a reading of the whole policy. It's like a reading of the title. Folks have already viewed the policy ahead of time, and they bring, for the first reading, they bring any concerns, questions, conversation topics.
We do it in a chunk. So like our policy committee meetings are 2 hours long, and we just get through as many as we can in 2 hours, right? And so like, our HR director, who happens to be the lead of our policy committee, she just works us through as many as we can. And then what she'll put in the board packet are just links to the red line versions of all of those that we worked through. That's what the board can look at. And then her presentation for the first reading is, okay, here's policy KL. You all had a chance to look at it. Any questions? Silence. Okay, here's policy GB. Here, like any questions? Somebody may say something. And then she sort of takes notes as we're going if anybody's got any questions. And so we just work through them as we can.
I really like the committee idea, and I think it's smart to have a couple teachers and Michelle and a couple board members. I think that would be really good governance. And question, so a lot, if I'm remembering correctly, like there were some policies last time that we just kind of had to do. They were required. And then there's some that there's some wiggle room in. And when the packet is sent to us, that's clarified in there.
So when it comes from OSBA, it's really clear, like, so bracketed language is always language you can change or choose from. And we generally have like a recommendation or something, but it's really clear that you can change that language. Bolded language is language that is like new, and there's usually some footnote or something that says, here's the ORS or the OAR that requires this. And you would take out that footnote, like you're just deleting that, and then it comes out, but it tells you what the source of that is. And then there's grayed out language that's like, you're going to delete this, and this is why. And so the policy department goes through and lets you know through instruction why everything is being added or deleted, so that you know that like you can't change this. It came straight from law, or it came straight from ODE, or it came, and then this is why we're deleting this. But there are, then there is, and sometimes even within required policies, there may be a little wiggle room. There may be some things that they're like, you can choose this or this, depending on your practice. But there's a lot of things, I mean, as you just said, Emily, that like in required policy, there's a lot that just comes straight from statute or rule. But it's clear within the document. And it does take some time. I mean, like the policy committee it takes some time, but if there is somebody who's willing to dedicate that time or who's got that time, it does save the board itself a lot of time in a meeting. So that can help. Any other questions on policy stuff?
I'm just going to send Spencer a quick email here while we're talking, just to make sure that we have the right people on that list. But generally, it would be, if I'm remembering correctly, it would be our ED and board chair. Is that correct?
You can have any board member you want on that. Like our board chair is not on it. It's me and one other board member. It's whoever has the time to do it. But ED being on it is a really good idea, because she's going to know a lot of, the substance.
I think maybe we should add to our next board agenda that conversation around whether or not to stand up a committee for that, a policy committee.
I won't be here, but I'll go with whatever the board says.
Cool. Do you want to be on the committee?
Sure. Yeah. Count me in.
Can be appointed in absentia.
Yeah, I'll volunteer for it ahead of time.
Okay. Any other questions about policies? Okay. There was a fundraising conversation that wanted to happen. Okay, what are your questions and thoughts about fundraising?
Well, that question came from our fundraising chair, who isn't with us this evening. I don't know if others recall. I think it had the question came out of the fact that the school is a charter school and a 501c3, and if there's any kind of, I don't know, guidance that you might have. I think that's what the general.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then like also just thinking about what have you seen that works well? We've been doing a lot of like kind of like PTO type fundraising, but then we've had ideas peppered in around like I think it was Marie, your idea on doing like a sustaining circle type of fundraiser, just anything that you've seen that works specifically well. Because fundraising takes a lot of energy, and a lot of times you put in a lot of energy but don't get a lot of funds
That's right.
necessarily.
So a few things, and some of these things take a lot of time, and some of them take specific expertise, and some of them take specific, like, who you know. So, so some charter schools that I have had experience with have enormous success doing like a big event every year, like an auction. And they do the vast majority of their fundraising because their families know that and community partners know, like, we do the auction. And they have like this huge auction and they make a ton of money. And they put a lot of energy into it. And that's their big event for the year. And so they're not doing as many like smaller piecemeal things all year long. They just have, but that takes time to sort of build up that momentum and for everybody to know that that's the big thing we're doing, for there to be, sort of a culture of participation in that. And for there to be sponsorships for that, because then there's community partners involved who are gonna, participate in, giving money to put that on and giving things to auction off. But there's that I've seen that works. When I was on a charter school board, my job on that board was to write grants, and I wrote grants because I'm good at grant writing, and that's what I did. I wrote grants. And that was one of the things, that is a way that I have seen charter schools do fundraising. This charter school particularly did not really go out to its family base because its family base was not a base that could give money or time. And so it was not, they did not approach their families and close community for funds because that was not possible. And so so we wrote grants, and we wrote a lot of them. And that's really time consuming. But that was part of the board's job in fundraising, was to like go get us money. That was part of the board's charge, was go get us money. And so that was part of my job, was to get grants for staff, specific staff members. And so that's what I did. So that is another way of doing that kind of thing, to pay for staff. Another thing that I have seen done, and this is sort of the like, who do you know, is the, board members working their professional networks for specific, donations, sponsorships, like ongoing philanthropic, like, do you have somebody who can be a benefactor of sorts, who can just give you 10 grand every year, or who's interested in that, or some sort of corporate partner, that kind of thing. Rarer, because not everybody who's on a charter school board has that kind of connection, and so that's not something you can necessarily like expect any board to build. That's kind of a person dependent kind of thing. That's sort of the who do you know. But there may be smaller organizations that you partner with that, may be able to do something like that, may be able to do a small sponsorship. And then there are the PTO kind of things, which most charter schools end up doing, right? Where it's mostly about like, driving families and driving, through community and really encouraging, family members and to keep giving throughout the year, usually in small amounts, but just keep giving throughout the year. And that takes a lot of time, a lot of sustained energy. And I'm sure you've experienced sort of the waxing and waning of the energy of families to keep doing that too, right? Or to keep like selling things on behalf of the school or, or whatever. I don't know how you do it, but like, I mean, in brick and mortar district schools, there's constantly a fundraiser for something. My daughter's in choir and it's like, like go buy a mattress for choir. And it's like, I can't, I can't buy a mattress for choir. And, so it's, there's a lot of ways to approach it. But those are the many ways that I have seen or combinations of those things. The interesting one to me that I think is underutilized is grant writing, because there are a lot of interesting sources of money out there. And I can't name any off the top of my head. The school that I was on the board of is Harmony Academy, which is a recovery school for students in recovery. And so we were writing very specific grants for very specific staff members that were like drug and alcohol counselors. And so not applicable to most charter schools in the state. But there are a lot of like little pots of money here and there, but it does take time, and it takes somebody who is really, interested in going and finding those things. But I do think that grant writing is underutilized, because there's stuff out there that there is money on the table, but it can be hard to find unless you got time.
I think
How
that's
do you do it now? How do you do your fundraising right now?
a lot of PTO
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, and then we've gotten some awesome large grants like through Department of Energy and stuff. But I think that that's a really good point that you bring up around asking families and asking families and asking families. And that was one of the things I've been thinking a lot lately, because we just did a fundraiser today, and there's a lot of communication going out to ask families for money and for donations. And that crossed my mind of, we're asking folks and a lot of folks can't, but we keep asking. And so I think that's something that we should think about, one, having some conversation around a strategic approach to funding and fundraising, and then broadening it out to grants or, different corporate or other benefactors, so that we're not putting our families in that situation as our only method, our only tool that we're using.
Right.
Because we do have a lot of families who can't participate in that way.
The other thing about, and it's a hard balance to strike, and I totally acknowledge that, because your families are right there. They're the ones sending their students to school. They have the most invested. It's natural to be like, can you give your time? Can you give some resources? That's the most natural and easiest place to do. I think that and I talked to a lot of charter schools about this, the balance to be stricken there is, does it eventually feel like, and this is just a question, this is not an accusation, this is a question I ask a lot of charter schools, is where does the balance tip where it feels like a barrier to families? Like if any school is asking to the point where families feel like, like they not only can't give, but there's an expectation there that they can't meet, do they feel like they don't belong here anymore? Like, when does that become a barrier? And I'm not saying it has or it's even close. It's just something to consider. Like I look at, and the reason I come to this question is that, when I'm doing evaluations of charter schools, one of the things that I do is I look at their enrollment application. And there are sometimes things on the enrollment application, like every family will be required to, like volunteer X many hours. Or if you can't volunteer this many hours, you got to give $500 a year. And I'm like, you can't do that, right? I mean, like that's a barrier to enrollment. And so, and fundraising, like, is a really tricky one because, you need that support from your community. And you also don't ever want to get to a point where it feels like, God, should I stay here if I can't give what's being asked of me? Right? Like, it's just an interesting thing to consider. Again, not saying it's there. It's just something to maybe talk about and think about as you look for alternative sources or think about other ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great question to raise, Kristen. And I think that as part of the vision planning that the board and the community are going to be embarking on, I think, boards are, of course, one of the important questions is to ask, well, how are the kids, doing, and are they learning, and how are the staff doing? And so this broader question of, well, how are families doing? How are they feeling about, what, they're receiving in the Tuesday folders, because there are a lot of activities and there are a lot of asks. And so I think it would be great for us to take the temperature on, how that's feeling for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or thoughts or discussion on fundraising? It's tough. I know. Okay. Yeah, Dan.
You have, experience writing grants. Do you have were there specific classes that you took that helped you develop that experience, or was it just you started writing them and you developed that experience over time on the job?
I developed it on the time on the job. I actually wrote an $8 million grant for ODE and it was successful. And and it was a federal grant. And what I learned from that grant is just literally answer the questions. Like, just answer the questions exactly how they ask them, and it will probably be successful. And that's what I've done in every single grant I've ever written since then. Just answer the questions exactly as they ask them, and all of them have been successful. I'm like, don't elaborate. Don't just follow the directions, like exactly as they ask them, which I can do really well. And that's it. So I never took a class. I'm like, but I could teach one in 5 minutes. Just follow the directions. That's my strategy. It is not refined. It is not eloquent. It is not anything. But somehow every grant I've written has gone through. All I do is follow the directions.
That's awesome. Not very many folks can say that who have written grants before.
I'm just gonna do what they tell me.
One thing that I'm sitting here thinking about is, oh, that's a great idea. We can totally take on writing some grants. We've had good success as a school community, at least.
Great.
And then my next thought is, well, what do we actually need funding for?
Mm-hmm.
We've been raising money for a playground revamp. We got a grant for a garden revamp. So we've been doing some cool things. But I wonder, that's another piece of that strategic planning that we should another piece we should consider in the strategic planning, like what grant or where can we use additional funding for our academics or for our teachers or for other pieces where there's, potential gaps. I personally don't know where those gaps are right now. I don't have a sense of that, but it would be, I think that there are board members who would be willing to try out writing some grants for the school if there are places where we're short and we could use more money.
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to identify gaps, and also I think we can make a call to the community, letting folks know that we need a grant writer. I mean, we have lots of retirees in our community who, you know, I just met someone today who's retired who came down to help with the jogathon and was just delighted to be there. I think he spent almost all day. And so, you know, I think we should just keep identifying gaps and just keep on letting the community know what we need. And also, yeah, as a board, you know, of course, I'm very inspired now that I've gotten Kristen's 2 cents on grant writing.
Just answer the question. You know, the tricky thing, the only and so projects are great. I think in my experience, writing grants for discrete projects is great. The tricky thing about writing grants for staff, and this may depend on whether it's a, you know, public or private grant, but like often you are not allowed to supplant something. You have to be adding something, right? Particularly when it comes to staff. That is
Like training, like a training opportunity.
Like a training opportunity is great, but like the grants that I've written have always been like, if it's for staff, you need to be adding a position, not just saying we're going to pay for this position over here with this money, which is really too bad because like what you want to be doing is like paying for staff with money. Like we need money to, you know, pay for staff. But like the grants that I've written have always been like, okay, you need to be adding an additional staff member to fulfill a very specific part of your mission vision or a very specific role. And now you need to defend why you need that role, right? It's not like you can say, we want to pay for this specific teacher with this money. That would be called supplanting, and most grants won't let you do that, right? But doing something for the playground or doing something for a garden program or doing something for the building or, you know, something like that is, there's money out there for those kinds of things. But I do think, Emily, your point about like being really coming together and being really thoughtful and being really strategic about, okay, what do we need money for? I mean, like, sure, we need money, but like, if we want somebody to invest some time and some research and some energy and some really good focused thought in writing us a grant, what do we want to be targeted about? Like, what is like, this is future looking. What is the next big thing? Like, is there FTE we want to add? And is it really specific to something? Or like, is there a big project that we need to take on or want to take on that, you know, that is really specific to our mission vision and, you know, and those kinds of things. I think that is really worthy of a board discussion to then really be strategic about if you wanted to use your resources in that way and going for grants, like really knowing what you would want to go for or what area you would want to send somebody out into to research.
Yep.
With that, what you said about like going for a grant to pay for like a position that is needed and then filling it, what happens down the line though, like when the grant runs out, or I mean, you got a plan for that, or you know what I mean? In your experience, how's that gone or that transition?
So that is usually, in my experience, that's usually something they want you to describe. Like, okay, so when this 3-year grant runs out, how are you going to sustain this?
Okay.
Right, because the funder does not want to dump a bunch of money on you that is just going to go to waste. So we'll have to fire this person when your money runs out, right? That like, yep, in 3 years, our intent is to have enough funding in this way that, you know, that we can sustain this, which is why it may be easier to look at discrete projects for now, or
But
other
even that,
things. Yeah.
like the first thing that came into my head on that one was like, well, we could like conflict resolution programs, for example. That's something that you could hire. You could get a grant to hire a professional to come in and establish a conflict resolution program for the school that is then 3 years later implemented by the teachers and the students. So it's like kind of, you only need that. You only need that position, that special position or role for a period of time. Something like that could be good grant money.
Yeah, that's professional development, right? Like we want to build a program. That's a discrete period of time. Yeah, absolutely.
So fun. This is great.
Mhm.
I like good things to think about.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, and then you wanted to talk a little bit about board advocacy. I know I've got you for a few more minutes. What was your thought about advocacy? What were you wondering?
Tiffany, do you want to take a lead on that one? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to, when I was thinking about that, it was like advocating to the community what the board is and letting them know who we are and how they can interact with us and those kind of things and building those relationships
Okay.
as a board with the community and yeah.
Yeah. So, some of the things that I see, so do you find that the community doesn't really know what the board does, who you are, what you do, what you don't do? Is that where you are right now? Is that the interest? Where does the interest come from?
I guess a little bit because I'm new to the board, so I
Mhm.
knew like, okay, they, resolve I mean, I didn't really know actually, honestly.
Yeah.
I before like deciding like, oh, I think I'm gonna try for the board, and then I looked into what they do a little more. But before that, no, and I didn't really feel, but also my child was new and I'm totally new to the school scene because he's only in first now. And so pre-K I was just kind of getting the toes in there and wasn't even really like privy to the board. But then in kindergarten last year, I was like, okay, like what's this? What's it about? But I didn't even I guess, really know. I mean, you can look on the website, but like, is it okay to contact my board? Like,
Right.
just being a new first time parent in a school district, it felt a little intimidating too.
Yep.
Like, so that kind of a thing. And I have a feeling probably a lot of parents feel that way.
Yep. I say to every single board, district or charter school, nobody knows what a board member does, and neither did you before you got on the board. It's just true. Um, so I think, and so this is a really common question, right? Because ultimately or eventually you get into a situation where somebody's like, "Hey, can you help me solve this problem? Like, I need you to solve this problem and I'm gonna like come to with you to or come to you with a complaint." And then you can't do that, right? Like, because that's not your job, and then it's an uncomfortable conversation, and and then you got to know how to navigate your way through that. I think that sometimes what I've seen boards do is, I don't know if you've got like a school newsletter that goes out or something like that, but I've seen boards put little like, "Hey, from the board" columns in that say like, "Here's what we're doing, here's what we're working on." um
I love
if you've got a board section, and you do have a board section on your website, don't you? Like a little
we do.
board page. Having that, I haven't memorized it, but like having that describe, like not only here's the board members, but like here's what we do. I think, and I say this in like I do a lot of conflict resolution too, and so I say this as this part as well. Not only describe what you do, but describing what you don't do is just as important, right? It's
For
like,
sure.
in the conflict resolution world, it's like, here's what I mean, but here's what I don't mean, right? So like it's describing like, here's the job of the board, but also here's what we don't do. And framing it really positively, but like, the board works as a collective. We are unable to resolve individual complaints. Like we will always direct you to the right resource, like those kinds of things, but trying to describe what you do, what your responsibility is, what your big responsibility is, and then what you don't do as well. Like, we're not administration. We don't get involved in the daily business. Like, we don't, like we are partners with our ED, that kind of thing. And trying to, give the community a little bit of that. But also, since not everybody in your school is going to be clicking on your board page on your website all the time, like who's going to do that? Putting stuff out in a newsletter like that. I think that, when you can show up, or if there are like big school events that happen every once in a while, having a board member maybe introduce those events, or being like, taking the mic or whatever, being part of that and saying, "Hey, like I'm so and so, I'm on the board, we're here to support, one of our roles is to," and just, just a little bit, and just kind of introduce that and be part of that. And then sometimes it is just individual education to families and community members who do come to you with like can you please help me solve my individual problem, and having to let them know that. And then always being invitational to people to come to board meetings. I know that's usually people don't come to board meetings unless there's something super exciting happening. But at least in my experience, most people don't like show up at board meetings unless there's something super exciting happening. But being invitational, that like if you want to know what's going on at the board level, like we have, like you can zoom in and like this is easy. Or you can watch our recordings. And here they are. And just, trying to get that word out there. Also, there are times where usually this isn't a time of conflict, or when things are tough, or when there are big needs, like having like, and I'm not saying that you're probably not here, but like, having like a listening session where you have the community come out, I would structure it really carefully. And if you ever get there, I'll help you do this. But like, where the community comes out, they talk to the board listens, the board is able to explain its role, that kind of thing. But I would start out with like being really clear on your website and including something about the board in any newsletter that goes out.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I like
Yeah.
the newsletter idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all good, but like that's like something we could do
You do
now
that
or
soon,
next
right?
month, Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Any other, well, I would ask you this. I think we hit all of the big pieces that you wanted to hit. Is that right? Did we hit all the big pieces that you wanted to hit? Okay. Anything else that I didn't answer that you wanted to talk through? I know we're at a couple hours, but is there anything else that you want to talk through, or that you want to think about, want to ask me, or want me to follow up on after tonight?
Are there, so we're, like we talked about earlier, we're at the beginning phases of our strategic plan update, and looking on those visions and all those kind of those topics that go along with that. Are there OSBA resources? We have someone local that we've been engaging with lightly on that, but are there OSBA resources we can use to assist with that? Kind of like with how you're assisting us now.
So you have somebody that's walking you through that you consulting with to do the strategic plan? Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
We haven't. I don't think we've agreed to the contract yet, but it's we're on the steps of that. I think probably the next meeting I won't be there for that. They'll decide on where to go with that. And correct me if I'm wrong, Emily or Tiffany or anybody else here, on where we ended up with that in our last meeting. But basically, someone that our ED has contact with to help move this forward and get it going. And it's a contract that you pay, and they help guide you through the strategic plan. You engage with the community, with the staff, and come up with something that. So I was just wondering if there's any additional resources throughout that we could use for that as well.
I don't. We would probably need to take that as a go. We do that too, so that would be like a competitor in a way.
I understand.
But I mean, I would be happy to help. So here's what I think I could do. Like, if you came across issues that you had questions about, like, how it would impact, like, if you had questions as they came up, like, that were technical questions, in the work, like, how would this impact board work as we've talked about roles and responsibilities, or are these things in alignment with the kinds of roles that we've talked about with like governance roles, or how would you fit these into the governance, like I said, we do strategic planning too. So I wouldn't, want to step on the toes of whoever you hired to do that. But I think that if you've got like roles and responsibilities questions that come out of that, like I would be happy to chat with you and answer questions about that. Or if you had some like public meeting law questions or things like that came up. We don't have anything on our website really, because what we have on our website is like, call us if you want to do strategic planning, and we'll do that with you. But
Can you give us, Kristen, can you give us like your elevator pitch of what your process looks like?
So we start with working with boards to develop strategic priorities. And we do community engagement in one of two ways. We either, and we work with the board to determine what this is. We either go out to the community and say, give the board some ideas about what the strategic priorities should be. We take that feedback and the board works to refine those, or we work with the board to develop some draft strategic priorities and then go out to the community and say, what do you think? Help us prioritize these. After that, we come back and refine those. And from there, what I like to do is take those strategic priorities and create a mission from there. I don't start with a mission or not a mission, with a vision, because that's just like a weird blank slate. Like we start with strategic priorities and then build the vision. The strategic priorities then get handed to the administrator to then turn into the action plan, the strategic plan, right? That's where the board steps back and doesn't do that detailed work. After that is done, then the administrator and team comes back and say, okay, you told us the what, here's the how. And the board looks for alignment between what they determined and what the plan is. And then they go about adopting that plan or asking for revision and really talking through that. And then finding the best ways. We work with them to find the best ways to communicate that to the community. At some point in that beginning stage, there needs to be a lot of community buy-in. And community, I mean teachers, families, whoever your community partners is, and students if that's appropriate. And so that's all in the beginning phase. We also, depending on the grade levels of the school, like to do portrait of a graduate. And I do this with high schools and K-8s, and I have yet to do it with K-5, but like, where we start with like, what do you want your students to experience when they leave your system? Like, who's the kid that leaves your system? What do you want them to go to the next step? And we'll often start with developing a portrait of a graduate and then say like, okay, with that in mind, what are your strategic priorities? I'm doing this right now with another charter school. And that's what we do. That's the pitch. So.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the kind of timeline and cost for your services?
Timeline depends on how, like, that is pretty negotiable. It's several months. It depends on how the length of time between like what you want to do as far as community engagement is honestly the most that can be the most time consuming thing, right? Like how do you want to outreach to the community? Do you want to do surveys? Do you want to do listening sessions? Like what do you want to do? And that determines sort of that scope of work right there. How you come back to do that and then do like, a strategic prioritization session, that's one session. I would book that for 3 hours, but it all depends on like, when do you want to do community engagement and how much of it do you want to do? That's a huge variable, Then your administrator needs time to go away and write the plan. And so I usually we talk about that as a group. Like, do you need 2 months to do that? What time of the year is it? Like, if it's over the holidays, we're going to need more time, right? Like, so most boards, it's a 6 to 9 month period that this happens in. And cost is a little variable depending. If we know that we can break it down into something like 4 or 5 sessions, I can usually give you like some bulk rate of like, breaking it down by session. If it's like, we're not sure and we just want to keep going, then we would do an hourly rate. I don't have my like calculator right here on me, but I mean, I could certainly, work up a proposal at some point, but I know you're trying to make a decision really quickly, but.
Do you support, or what would your engagement look like with the community engagement part?
So that would be up to you. I could be as involved as you wanted me to be, or as supportive behind the scenes as you wanted me to be. And that's usually like depending on cost, right? So like if there is a survey that you wanted me to develop and administer, then I could do that. I could gather back information, analyze the information, present that to you. If there were community meetings you wanted me to come and facilitate, I could do that too, right? There's travel expenses involved in that. There's hours involved in that. If there were Zoom meetings, there's no travel expense for that. That's just hours, right? But if you wanted to do those yourself, and you could also do those, I would say that your facilitator probably should be, if you wanted to do community meetings, probably should be involved in those in to some respect, because that's the person that's also going to want to know like what your community said to you at some point. But that is also dependent on, what your price point is or what kind of involvement you want. Typically, I tend to end up doing both a survey and at least one listening session, like an in-person thing or a virtual thing and a survey. That's typical. Any other questions or things that you want me to follow up on after this meeting, or anything else you need from me? Okay.
I think in the future, as we look towards next year and look towards someone else being the board chair, that kind of, we've talked about the succession planning in the past a little bit, but really helping develop some systems that will help our future board members be successful in those roles.
Yeah.
I think I've talked to our ED quite a bit about kind of adjusting how we run our board meetings, how we set our consent agenda. There's probably some more streamlined ways we can do that makes it a little easier on those members to, create those documents, but also to run those meetings. And so I'm open to that kind of education. Just as we prepare for those things, I want us to be successful in the long term. So, personally, my goal would be that next May, June, I'm no longer the board chair and I'm still on the board as in a supportive role, but someone else has taken that up. And so I want to prepare our members for that so that we are successful moving into that.
Yeah, that's great. I also heard maybe a desire for like some better systems in onboarding. Did I hear that correct? Okay. I have a great example of a charter school that has put together on its website like a whole set of links that they send to their board members, like that is just super comprehensive. And once they come on. Now, part of their thing is like, you just send us links and we don't talk through it. I mean, so there's their system development there. But the first step is like, they get all these links and it's a ton of information. And that is a beginning of a really good system because it's a bunch of information. We could talk about that kind of system development too.
That would be
great. I think just maybe, thank you, Tiffany. Yeah, that kind of onboarding and maybe a scheduled thing where, hey, we know we're going to elect new members in May. June, they're going to be appointed, maybe July or somewhere in there, we do another board training that onboards those new members. So here's your documents, but here's also a meeting with you that helps onboard them right at the very beginning. So here, and then they'll have one meeting under their belt maybe, and then they have that process that kind of, okay, here's just how this goes. And it's repetitive for some, but it's useful for everybody so that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to know the name of that charter school.
It's the Lighthouse School.
Oh, okay. I'm going to check that out.
Yeah.
Thank you. And also OSBA is so great about hosting webinars. And I think, what Dan just said about members being on board in July, having an initial meeting, learning about OSBA, what's available in terms of resources, all of that. I think, it's essentially continuing education. Being a board member, there's just so much to learn all the time.
It never stops.
It never stops. And I also, this just popped into my head recently because we are going to have 3 seats, I believe, next May opening, and we have our application. And I know that, you know, one of the important questions, or I think one question we could ask folks is, do you think, you know, all children can succeed, and see what people say on their application? Because I think it's such what you said, you know, it's incredible that such a simple thought could have such an impact on student.
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, something.
Yeah. Well, let me know if you need anything, as always. Happy to, you know, as you get new members, as you start thinking toward, check out the Lighthouse Schools page for their board members. Click on all those links. It's great. They've got board operating agreements. They've got their bylaws up there. They've got their contract up there, like all kinds of stuff. Their policies, it's all up there. And would be happy to, as you get new members, you know, think about what you want to do next as far as talking about some systems and whatever you need. And you know where to find me in between.
Thank you so much, Kristen. This has been
Yeah.
a really helpful education.
Good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. And then as we have to vote to adjourn, don't we?
Oh,
The very end.
Since we do have
I'll
to.
second it. No,
All right, I make a motion, we adjourn the meeting.
I
Second,
second.
thank you, Tiffany. All those in favor? Any opposed, voice or opposition? All right, have a great evening. Thank
Bye,
you,
guys.
Robin.
Bye-bye.